Hello and welcome to our conversation in data science languages. Today I thought I'd spend some time going over three different IDEs, integrated development environments. And part of the reason for this is that sometimes, depending upon your environment, you may need to know about how to do things in, say, Visual Studio Code versus Jupyter Notebooks or at Python at a command line. The whole point of integrated development environments is efficiency and speed and productivity. That's the basic idea. So with that in mind, we'll go ahead and jump straight in. We'll talk about three of them today, three different development environments. We'll start with Visual Studio Code, PyCharm, and Visual Studio Community Edition. All three of these are free for educational and personal use. Visual Studio Community Edition's a little funny, and we'll talk about the licensing when we get to that. But the other two are certainly fine. Pretty much for any situation. So Visual Studio Code, and I'll refer to it as either VS Code or Code, depending upon my mood. So what is it? So it's basically a free alternative to things like PyCharm. Microsoft decided that maybe it was in their best interest to offer something that kind of competed in that space, but compete's kind of a weird word because they give it away. But it is intended to solve kind of a particular set of problems, and to some extent it's a bit different than PyCharm, probably closer to some of the other development tools you might see because it's directory oriented. There's not a solution or project concept inside of VS Code. It's very much about a directory. So you create a directory, you put files in it, and you edit them, and they all have something to do with each other. So it's not so much around things like Visual Studio Community Edition, which has a concept of essentially a solution, and solutions contain projects, and projects contain files, and those also potentially correspond to folders, but don't necessarily have to. So it's a different approach, a different mentality, a different way of doing things, and that's primarily because some people prefer to think that way. It's also kind of more in line with, perhaps, if you think about things like GitHub, and version control of that sort. Those are kind of almost more folder oriented to some extent. Visual Studio Code does support a lot of different languages through the concept of extensions. These extensions are essentially plugins, or they're potentially authored by various people that allow you to do several things. We'll take a look at Visual Studio Code in a little bit, but for now we're just going to kind of talk through kind of what it is. You do download it from code.visualstudio.com. That's where you'll be going. So what does it look like? It's a pretty clean interface. It's pretty simple. Everything on the left nav is around kind of selection of stuff. The menu bar across the top is the typical file, edit, select, and so on sort of menu that you'll see in a lot of applications. It's relatively smart. It recognizes a language, and generally speaking, it's pretty smart in that if you have a language that it knows about, but you don't have the extension installed for it, it'll say, "Hey, do you want this extension?" Which is kind of cool. So, if a last sort of note to make sure you understand with Visual Studio Code is that just because it supports editing of Python doesn't mean that it necessarily knows how to interpret Python. In order to do things like actually debug or run your programs, you're going to have Python installed on the system. So it doesn't remove that challenge. It just simply makes it a whole lot more effective. It makes it easier for you to edit the code, even debug the code with breakpoints and so on, but you still have to have the compiler or interpreter. The Python extension is the thing that makes the magic happen as far as Python goes. You essentially install it through the configuration, and it may, like I say, be smart enough to prompt you that, hey, you want this. It does basically provide a certain amount of IntelliSense. So it'll do things like tell you if you've mistyped a keyword, highlights those words for you, and so on. Also makes it to where you can do code navigation and debugging, formatting, all kinds of good stuff, right? So very powerful sort of tool. When you go to install the extension, you'll basically do so by clicking on the little boxes that look like little cubes there, right? So let's point at that, right? So this little thing over here, that's how you actually do the installation of the various components that you want to do, so the extensions. You probably will have to restart it after you do the installation of Python. and you need to select a Python interpreter. And it will probably tell you if you don't have one and say, hey, do you want to go get one? And if you say yes, it'll take you to the python.org site where you'll download the latest version of Python 3.9.6 in this case. So those are kind of the things to know about editing it. I'm not sure why I have that in there twice. So Jupyter, the Jupyter extension. You can actually edit Jupyter notebooks inside of Visual Studio Code as well. It basically allows you to do a rather simplistic sort of thing. Again, though, you have to have the kernels installed separately. So it'll allow you to do notebooks that are written Python, R, C#, Rust, whatever. But again, you do have to have the various kernels, these language kernels, installed. And that's part of kind of what goes with Jupyter. So it just provides a slightly different interface. You can open a folder with Visual Studio Code after you've installed it by basically right-clicking somewhere inside of the folder and selecting Open with Code, and that'll open up, and you can see the little icon there, open up inside of Visual Studio Code inside of that directory. You can also do so at a command prompt. So if you happen to be a person that enjoys command line editing, you can type in code and then dot or whatever directory of interest, so dot being the current directory, and it'll pop open Visual Studio Code in that directory. Interestingly enough, it also can work inside of the Windows subsystem for Linux, something we'll probably talk about later. So you can basically have Linux running on your machine and open up Visual Studio Code by typing code dot inside of a bash shell, and it'll actually open up code in the native Windows environment, but allow you to edit the files that are in that directory inside of Linux. So pretty cool stuff. So whenever you go to open up a notebook that has code, you still have to have a Python interpreter, and you can basically edit the notebook in a way that looks a lot like a regular notebook. I'll show you this in a moment whenever we actually kind of go through the thing. And notice it tells you, hey, you don't have Python installed, so you can't be doing things like pip install and so on. So you basically need to install it before it'll let you run it. So in this case, you have to select which interpreter you want to use. And then it also will tell you, hey, you may need to go install a kernel if you're trying to run a notebook. So enough talk, let's take a look at what it actually looks like. So again, to keep me honest, I created a virtual machine, and it's a clean virtual machine. I haven't installed anything. So if we open up the start menu, this is what it looks like whenever you first just spin up a machine. This is a relatively new version of Windows. I think it's the H1 2021, so the first half of 2021's kind of stable build here. So the way this works, I went ahead and navigated to Visual Studio Code, and you just click on download to get the binaries. For simplicity, I'm just using Edge. Generally speaking, I don't use it. So after it finishes, you say, yeah, I want to open it, install it, and it goes through. It's not meant to be ran as administrator because apparently I'm running as an administrator, but that's not a big deal. In this case, click next through the various licensing agreement, and you can basically it talks through what is allowed and what's not allowed. Generally speaking, as long as you're not trying to make money off of it, you're probably okay. Select the defaults are perfectly fine for this. You probably want to go ahead and say add the open with code to the Windows Explorer directory and file context, so that you can do the right click, open up, so on inside of File Explorer. And then now we just basically do the installation. It shouldn't take real long because it's a pretty lightweight install. And once it's finished, we can go ahead and launch it and take a look at what it looks like. So imagine, I guess, now that maybe we might want to actually create something. So you can say open a folder because it's saying, hey, you haven't opened anything. I'll probably go down into documents, create a new folder. We'll call this Hello World. Navigate to it and then select it. And all that did was basically set it so we're now inside of Hello World. It asked also, do you trust the people inside of the parent folder? So yes, this is, since it's me, sure. Also, you want to probably select a theme. This is going to say how do you want it to look. Probably most people anymore go with dark themes, but it's entirely up to you, your preference. And at this point, we can actually start creating a file. So nothing here yet, but we can say plus file, and we'll say hello.py. And so now it said, hey, look, that looks a lot like a Python file, right? Do you want to install the extension for Python? We say sure. And it takes us over to what I'd shown you before about the Python extension. And we're going through the process of doing the installation. So once it's installed, then it knows, and it looks like it finished. We can go back into our thing, into our file, and say, hey, print. And notice what it's doing there. See, whenever we type print, right? And so print, and it knows that when I hit the parentheses, it tells me what does it look like. So that's the signature for print, right? And I put a string. Notice it typed the second one for me. Kind of a lot of things do that these days. Can be helpful depending upon how you write your code. And then we can say hello, comma, world. But then now at the point that it's also figured out, hey, you don't have Python installed. So do you want to go put Python on? So we can go ahead and say, sure, I'll download it. We'll go ahead and, for simplicity, install the version that it prompted us to. Open it up, do the install. And at this point, we're waiting for Python to basically get installed because this is a clean system. If you have Python already installed inside of your environment, then it'll potentially prompt you for which one do you want to use. And if you're like my machine, you've got lots of different ones. So it's smart enough to know where they're at and know which one you might want to use. So at this point, we're going through the process of basically getting it kind of up installed on the Windows environment. And we just finished. So at this point, it might know it's here. So let's see what happens if we try to run, right? So you can go up here and say, and just for fun, we'll say print goodbye world. And then the reason I did that is so I can set a breakpoint. So over here in the leftmost column, you can type up here onto the little red dot, and it basically sets a breakpoint. Breakpoints are things that allow you during execution to pause the debugging. I went ahead and saved that, so now I'm going to say start debugging and see what happens. And say we're going to debug the file. And now it's saying the Python path in your debug configuration is invalid. Open launch.json. So let's go ahead and do that. And it should have prompted. Come on, where are you at? All right. And at that point, it should run it. Let's try it again. Okay, always fun when things don't work according to plan. Wouldn't hurt to go ahead and restart. That'll also let us show the open from code. So inside of my documents, I said hello world, and say here open with code. Let's see if that makes a difference. You'll notice also there's a debug console, your output, if there's something that's wrong with your code, and so on. Terminal is a command prompt, pretty much in that directory. So I should be able to say Python hello.py, and it will run it. And for some reason it didn't print out, so that's kind of interesting. Probably it printed out to the terminal, but not to the console. So we didn't actually get to see it. There we go. That's what it needs, just a restart. So you can see here, this is the current line that's about to be evaluated. Across the top, you get the typical debugging sort of things you can step into, step over, step out. These are typical sort of debugging patterns. There's also, generally speaking, going to be some keys that let you step forward. So you can step over with F10, step into with F11. F5 will continue. So I'll just hit F11. There's only one. You can see down here it printed out hello world. If I hit F11 again, it'll say goodbye world, and then we exit it. So that's getting us up and running in a very simple way with Visual Studio Code. We'll go ahead and move on to PyCharm next. So PyCharm, what is it? It's an editor. There's both free and commercial versions. It's offered by a company called JetBrains. The basic idea is that the community edition is kind of the open source ish sort of solution that is kind of that gateway, right? They're trying to get you into their environment so that whenever you go to work somewhere that you want to buy their product or recommend their product. There's various barriers that they put in place, so paywalls, if you will, to get you to upgrade to the real thing. It does include similar to Visual Studio Code in the sense that there's an IDE debugger code, inspectors, and so on. It does support things like refactoring and as well version control, which Visual Studio Code also supports most of that. You get it at jetbrains.com/PyCharm. What's it look like? A lot like Visual Studio Code, and that's probably not an accident. Probably the bright developers at Microsoft decided to make something that was familiar to the open source community and to the Python developers in general. So they kind of borrowed from it, although realistically the left nav, not something that one entity controls, nor is it having your grouping of things and a menu across the top. It's kind of the typical pattern of the most applications that are developed today. You do have the ability to create and manage virtual environments similar to what you do with Anaconda. So, so in that regard, it is kind of a little bit of a similar in a way, I guess, to Anaconda, in that it does lets you manage virtual environments, be able to select them and control them, and so on. You also need to configure a Python interpreter as well, although it's a little less separate. And you can also notice there that there is integration with Conda, because the next choice down about in your interpreter is Conda environment. So it does play nicely together. It does support R via a plugin, so you can install R just like you can in Visual Studio Code. Visual Studio Code will support R as well. Jupyter Notebook support. This is one of those paywalls, right? If you want to be able to edit notebooks inside of PyCharm, then you're going to buy the professional version. So that is one of the things that is a little bit different. So to take a look at it, let's go through the similar process. We'll go and minimize this, close that, switch over to PyCharm, and go ahead and click on download the free trial. Sorry, no, we don't want the free trial. We want the community free open source version. And you basically don't need to do that. It should pop and be downloading. Already it was. And so once it's done, we can open it. Probably cancel one of those. Okay, yeah, we're coming up. So does launch the setup. Go ahead and click through next. Next. You have the choice of putting it on your desktop or not, adding it to the path. Probably don't really need it. You might want to do context of open a folder as project, so that's kind of handy. You have the choice of associating it with Python files as well. And the next thing is to go ahead and go through the installation process. Going back a page while it's doing that, to determine the licensing sort of thing. Let's see, where was it at? Developer tools, PyCharm. There's usually a breakdown of what's allowed for where. If you're using it in a commercial setting, though, you start getting into some funny stuff, right? So, but there is also an educational edition, which happens to be the same thing as the free free open source edition. So still going through the download, but it is an established product, a little more obviously centric on Python, hence the name PyCharm, but it does support other languages just as Visual Studio Code does. So while their focus is definitely in the Python space, and that's kind of where it came from, they saw the benefits of having a modular architecture and being able to do extensions as well. So it can be extended to handle additional languages. And at this point, we're just waiting for all the binaries to get installed. And let's go ahead and run it. And so once it comes up, it'll be a very sort of similar experience to, you have to agree to their licensing agreement, just like most places. You're asking if you want to be a good corporate citizen or a good open source citizen, and send anonymous statistics so they can determine if things go wrong. And I must have downloaded the wrong one. So that's that's when I clicked onto the wrong thing. So going back, download the community edition. Seemed like it had the same name for whatever reason. But clearly it did not. Go through the installation again, this time the community edition, not the professional trial version. So yeah, don't make that mistake. You certainly don't want to be paying for anything until you're certain that's something you would want to use. Also, more likely than not, if you're needing the professional version, you probably are working for somebody that will pay to have it installed. Nearly there. So again, installation is a one-time thing. It's obviously slower whenever you're in a classroom sort of situation, but now we can go ahead and run the community edition, and should be a similar sort of experience, although without as much of a license. You do have to agree to the community edition's terms, and it's generally speaking very similar. It's just that certain functionality is not going to be present in the community edition. So you end up on a screen kind of somewhat similar to what some of the other things are. The choice here is to create a new project, and as I mentioned, this is a little more project based, although it does have the ability to create open folders as projects. We'll create one called Hello, and let's see here, we can pick a virtual environment, and let's just see what happens when we create. So we go and created a new environment. We can say, and it's creating the virtual environment, and then it seems it gives you the tips of the day where you can learn how to use the product while it's finishing creating the virtual environment. And this, again, is kind of similar to what you would do with Anaconda. If you have Anaconda installed, you could just select it as your environment. And because it is kind of a bit more of an advanced thing, you have kind of it starts with a pattern of how your application would be structured. And you'll see this a fair amount, where it figures out that if you're being called as essentially the main part of a program, then it'll invoke a function. Sometimes you might call it print hi. Sometimes you would say hello or run main or something else. So that's basically the entry point, is so that you come back up and run this, right? So we're going along, we define it, then this says if it's coming in and you're actually running this as the main program, then we'll go ahead and step into that. So let's set a breakpoint, and we'll go ahead and just say debug main, and that's this file. Interestingly enough, it does something with opening up some ports, so you have to allow access for whatever reason. Not 100% sure what it's talking to, but you do have the ability here, this is an interesting feature as well, to do collaborative development inside of PyCharm. So you can talk with other people. That might be part of what that firewall thing is that's popping up. So we entered into the program, and we can see also with hover inspection of what values things are, right? So I click on this and I say, well, what is that, right? And it shows me what the value of it is, right? And it happens to be that it's a thing that we're looking for. So again, you have underneath of the run menu, debug, and there's also the ability to kind of step along up, I believe, here, right? And also that's to get us going. So should be able to hit like F10 because that's kind of a common thing. All right, so F5 then. No. Maybe I click on that. Oh, is it up here? Yeah, here we are down here. So F7 steps into. So not necessarily all that standard. So basically stepped into this function because we called it from right up here. You can hover again to see what the value is, PyCharm, prints it out, and it should go to a window somewhere, probably the debug, out to the terminal maybe, no. Not sure where it went. Anyway, and then we basically can exit the program. So that's basically PyCharm getting started. Go ahead and debug that again just for fun and talk a little bit about some of these other things down here. So it was F7 to step in. You do have some local sort of things. So down in here we have the variables. We can see what the value of the variables are. This is our call stack, so we can see what's going on. This is basically resuming, so F9 will run. And we can also, should be a step out, which will take us back out to the main. So we came back out. It did print it out somewhere, so it was on the console here, not console down here. So you get a little bit of a navigational, I wouldn't rate that as terribly great, right? And then we can let it finish. So that's basically PyCharm. Not a bad IDE. It's a lot of these come down to personal preference and what tools you're familiar with and what your history is. So with that, we can continue our discussion, moving into Visual Studio Community Edition. So what is it? So you may have heard of Visual Studio, maybe not. It is a very well developed and a very mature product, been around for years and years, decades even. What it does is allow you to edit and create lots of different types of products and programs. Supports lots of different environments, lots of different targeted sort of solutions, and very strong. The Community Edition is kind of the free version of it. So it's one that is very explicit that it's free for individual and academic / educational purposes, right? So for this class, perfectly fine. If you want to go and create a startup, then you need to make sure that you're smaller than 5 people. So if you and 5 of your friends decided to start a company that needed an IDE to write code in, Visual Studio Community Edition's off the table. You'd have to buy the full-fledged version. So basically it's very limited to very, very small organizations. Does support lots of different languages, and it does so in a slightly different way. It's almost more of like a feature pack selection rather than a plugin model. So you decide what components of the entire suite of things that are Visual Studio you want to have installed. Does support both directory and project oriented solutions. However, probably a bit of a bias towards project and solution sort of oriented. The splash screen, pretty straightforward, especially the first time you run it. It asks you pretty much what do you want to do. Open something you've opened before or create something new. The right side being creating something new. You can also either clone things from a repository such as GitHub or DevOps. You can open existing solutions. So if you've got something that ends in .sln, you can open that up, or you can open a local folder and deal with it in a folder pattern. Or you could create a new project entirely with some sort of scaffolding. So that's one of the really powerful things Visual Studio brings to the table, is that for the common patterns, so if you're going to go build a Node.js sort of web application, or you're doing something with C# and ASP.NET, the starter solutions will get you pretty far along. In this case, you're probably going to want to start with a Python application, give it a name, a location for the repo, and a name, and it will go ahead and create one for you. Also notice that it's smart enough to know, depending upon what's going on, that what packages are installed and not installed, so you can actually go in here and say, I need to install this, and if you can actually type, then it'll say install pandas, so you click on that, and it'll basically go and add it. Temporarily have to elevate the permissions to administrator, and when it's all said and done, it will have installed the package for you. So pretty smart, right? And then rather than wait for all that, we'll just shift over and do the interactive portion. So we'll go to the Visual Studio Community Edition of version 2019 of Visual Studio, and go ahead and click on download. This downloads basically kind of a small shell that lets you pick what it is you actually want to install. There's a lot of stuff available depending upon what you do. You can pick your workload, right? So basically we get started with just a shell. This isn't actually installing Visual Studio, really. What this is doing is the Visual Studio installer. So it's getting ready to tell us, well, what do you want to install? So again, it's broken down by workloads. So you can basically, depending upon what it is you're wanting to do a lot of stuff pretty much for free, assuming you're doing it for individual work. So you can do things with ASP.NET. You can create stuff that runs inside of Azure. You can do some Node.js if that's your thing. We're probably interested in Python, right? You can additionally, if you're so inclined, create desktop applications such as Windows Forms or WPF, or even your old tried and true console application in the language of your choice, including C#, VB, F#, and so on. But for now, we're just going to do Python, because the more things you install, the more time it takes. And we might want to go ahead and just install, we definitely want the Python 3 64-bit. Probably don't need most of this other stuff, right? If you did, you could go ahead and select it. Perhaps you want to target the 32-bit for some reason, or maybe you're old school and want to run Python 2, which hopefully you don't, because it's like old, like really old. So at this point, it's actually installing those components that we picked, right? And it shouldn't take terribly long, because we're not installing a whole bunch of stuff. We're just installing Python. Once it goes through that, then it works its way through the various packages so that we can actually launch the thing. At this point, it's downloaded everything it needs. It's just going through the installation process. The thing whenever you'd want to consider when you're deciding between these three tools is, it probably depends on what you know and what you've done before. If you are a .NET developer, or you've worked in Visual Studio before, you'll probably go with either Visual Studio Code or Visual Studio Community Edition. Likely Community Edition, because you're more familiar to, it'll be more familiar to you. It's basically the same thing as a full-fledged version of Visual Studio, with primarily the difference being around licensing. And there's some additional sort of enterprise class stuff that's not going to be available to you as well. If you're coming just brand new, you probably want something simple. You might think about Visual Studio Code. You might think about PyCharm. depends upon kind of your disposition, right? So disposition. So if you really like simple but yet extensive ways, those two tools are pretty compatible and comparable. Kind of may depend on what you like. Personally, I kind of like Visual Studio Code. I think it balances pretty nicely between being lightweight but yet pretty powerful and extensible. Visual Studio Community Edition I have on my desktop. I don't open it up nearly as often as I do VS Code. So that's it. And I have Python installed as well, or PyCharm installed as well. I almost never open that up, but that's kind of my bias. I'm more likely to be using a Jupyter notebook than I am something else. So while this is going through, you really kind of have to decide what works for you, what's available for you based upon the organization you work within, so that you're not obviously violating any licensing agreements. And sometimes there are standards that you'll have to consider. So some organizations say this is what we use as an enterprise, so you must use this tool. And it could be something like Eclipse or something else that may not be quite as enjoyable to use. But you do what you have to do, right? So you have to stay in compliance with whatever it is that you're working in. And so we've just about finished installing, so then we can take a quick look at it. And you also have the choice while this is finishing up. If for some reason you decided that I now want to go out and learn F# and write an F# desktop application, you have the ability to go back and modify your installation of Visual Studio Community Edition as well. And you do so basically by clicking here on the available and figuring out what it is you want to customize, essentially. Not totally sure why we're seeing two copies of the same thing, but anyway, interesting. So you can have the choice to sign in, but you don't necessarily have to. If you do, it can potentially do some syncing across your devices if you have preferences. But it basically asks you, okay, well, what do you want to do here, right? So you might want to say general, and then you can pick your color preference. You might want to go with blue, you might want to go extra contrast, or you may want to go dark. So we'll just go dark, and it's going through the process of configuring, of saying, okay, this is what you want. It shouldn't take real long. But again, you have the choice of going back and basically doing some additional installation of items if you're so inclined. So we're now up and running. This is the splash screen. There's nothing to open because we haven't opened anything before, so we can go ahead and say we want to create a new project. Probably want to create a Python application since that's what we're doing. So you can select that. You also have the choice of some other thing, a cookie cutter clustering project that will basically get you started if you want to do some clustering. It looks like we've got some regression here. And you might want to create a project from some existing code. So we'll just start with a typical Python application. Go ahead and click next. We give it a name. You have the choice of having your project and your solution be in the same folder. If you don't pick that, the project will be at a nested level. The idea being that your solution might have multiple projects over time. That's a lot of history, probably not something you're going to do in Python, but in something like .NET, you oftentimes would separate your user interface sort of stuff, your layer that deals with the person that's using it, with the actual business logic. You might have that as a separate class library. But for Python, probably doesn't matter too much. Could even stick them in the same directory because you're unlikely to create an additional project inside of Python. Though you could, who knows? So it basically creates kind of the scaffolding of the solution with an empty hello world, and we can just say print hello. And also, if we want to say import pandas, it'll say, I don't quite know what that is, right? and it's actually telling me, what is this thing? So we don't know what pandas is. So we may need to go and see if there's any environments to use. So we're going to go with 3.9. Looks like it knows that exists. And let's go ahead and see what happens if we set a breakpoint. All right, it's not wanting me to set a breakpoint. And then now we can go up and say debug, start debugging. So it doesn't know what pandas is, right? So let's go ahead and just continue, see if it'll continue. It doesn't found it, so we exit it out. Python environment. Manage Python, and let's say pandas. In the process, we're getting NumPy and 6 for free. And this is a tabbed interface, so you can see here the solution. If you were to want to add additional sort of files, it looks like it just now showed us that it's installed. If we go and try to set a breakpoint, and then start debugging, with any luck, it will print. So somewhere it printed hi, probably output. It also told us that it loaded some things, and it just finished. So that's basically Visual Studio Community Edition. Not a bad environment. It does a lot of things. It's very powerful, but it isn't quite the same kind of thing as some of the other tools. There is an extension. You do have the ability to add extensions to the environment depending upon what it is you're trying to accomplish. There's likely some Python specific extensions as well, so that if you're wanting to connect to various services using Python and so on. So that's Visual Studio Community Edition. So back to our presentation. So you may be asking yourself, well, what one do I use? And then, like I said before, it depends on what you like. It's a personal decision. For this course, once you get past the initial module of showing that you can install RStudio, R, Jupyter, and Python, it really doesn't matter too much on what you use. Python notebooks are nice because they are easy to both edit in, run, and your results whenever you run them are persisted, so that if you were to submit your Python notebook, I can see that it probably really worked, right? So that's one thing that's nice about it. I kind of like them, but there are times that you want a more expressive sort of experience. So that's notebook-oriented development isn't for everyone. Not everybody likes it. So pick something that works for you. And as always, if you have any questions about the material we talked about here today, let me know. That's what I'm here for. Keep up the good work. Those of you that are turning in things, and those of you haven't, you don't want to get too far behind. Bad things happen when you get behind. So make sure you're kind of plodding along. Now would be probably a good time to get Module 1 turned in, because we're into Module 2. If you do 1 a week, you don't find yourself trying to do 5 in a week. So with that, stay safe, and we'll talk again soon.